Now we get everything, my son whispered at my wife's funeral while her casket was still open. I hadn't even set down the flowers when he handed me pre-signed eviction papers and cancelled my debit card that same night. Then he emailed my neighbors to warn them I was losing it. He thought I'd crumble, but Evelyn had outmaneuvered him, quietly, methodically. One note, one locked drawer, one tape. He thought the funeral was the end. It wasn't. It was the trigger. And what that tape revealed, it changed everything. I've got 6 days to prove I'm not senile or lose my home forever. My name is Walter Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. Each morning, I still brew 2 cups of coffee out of habit, the second one growing cold beside Evelyn's writing desk, while I polish its surface with lemon oil. My son Michael, once the light of our lives, barely calls these days except to press about finances and paperwork that he insists needs immediate attention. The house that Evelyn and I built together over 47 years feels both empty and watchful now, but I notice how she labeled everything twice in her meticulous way, even the backing of old photographs. Despite my son's recent pushing and probing, I hold one quiet comfort. Evelyn never did anything without purpose, including her peculiar filing system. My fingers trace her. Careful handwriting on recipe cards, while funeral lilies fill the air. But let me start from the beginning. You ever notice how some sounds stick with you forever? That hollow echo of dress shoes on church marble, or the way organ pipes seem to shake the very air? I can still hear every creak of Evelyn's casket as we carried her down that center aisle. My shoulders weren't what they used to be, but I'd be damned if I wouldn't do this last thing for her properly. Michael stood off to the side, hands clasped in front of him like he was already conducting business. Hadn't shed a tear that I could see. Just watched us pass with this set to his jaw that reminded me of when he'd try to hide something as a kid. Funny how those old parent instincts never quite leave you. The service itself passed in a blur of hymns and sympathetic faces. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished wood of her casket, letting the familiar rituals wash over me. Pastor Jenkins said some nice words about eternal rest and devoted marriages. If you'd asked me to repeat any of it 5 minutes later, I couldn't have done it. You know that peculiar quiet that follows a funeral, when the last mourners drift away and even the church seems to hold its breath. I was standing there in that hollow silence, straightening my tie one last time, when Michael appeared at my elbow. His breath was warm against my ear as he leaned in close. Now we get everything. 4 words. Just 4 simple words. But they hit me like a physical blow. My stomach turned to stone, and I swear I could feel every year of my age pressing down on my shoulders. Grief has a way of making you vulnerable, sure, but this wasn't just grief anymore. This was something else entirely. That night, I wandered our hallway like a ghost, touching each framed photo as I passed. Evelyn and me on our wedding day, Michael's high school graduation, family Christmases when the world seemed simpler. I kept hearing Michael's whisper, turning it over and over in my mind. We, everything. The words felt wrong, like a splinter under the skin. 2 days later, I met Michael at the attorney's office downtown. Remember those old mahogany law offices they used to have, with brass fixtures and leather chairs? That creaked when you sat down. This was one of those, all very proper, very official. Michael had the folders ready before I even took my seat. "It's all quite straightforward, Dad," he said, sliding papers across that gleaming desktop. Mom made her wishes very clear. I might be old, but I'm not blind. Those documents named Michael as sole executor of Evelyn's estate. Every major decision, every financial move, had to go through him first. The language was dense with legal terms, but the message was crystal clear. I was being sidelined in my own life. "Mr. Whitaker," the attorney began, his voice carefully neutral, "do you have any questions about the arrangements?" Before I could open my mouth, Michael jumped in. "Dad and I have discussed everything thoroughly, haven't we, Dad?" His smile was too practiced, too smooth. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to know about the appeals process." "Oh, that won't be necessary," Michael cut in. "Everything's properly executed. Mom knew exactly what she was doing." The attorney shuffled some papers, not quite meeting my eye. "Any challenges would need substantial grounds, given the clear documentation." I left that office into the late afternoon sun, my head spinning. The signatures looked right. I'd know Evelyn's handwriting anywhere, but something felt off. Pressure leaves marks that aren't always visible on paper. Back home, I stood in front of Evelyn's writing desk, the one she'd polished every Sunday after church without fail. The wood still gleamed, but the brass lock caught my eye in a new way. 47 years of marriage, and I'd never once questioned why she kept it locked. I don't know what possessed me to call the family lawyer at dawn, but sleep wasn't coming anyway. Maybe it was the way the first light hit. Evelyn's empty chair by the window. She used to sit there with her morning coffee watching the birds. The house felt wrong without her routine filling its corners. You ever notice how lawyers' offices always open exactly at 9, not a minute before? I must have left 10 messages between sunrise and then each one a little more desperate than the last. When Patricia Chen finally called back around noon, her voice had that careful neutrality that makes your stomach drop. "Mr. Whitaker, I've reviewed your situation," she said, paper rustling in the background. "However, there are some complications we need to discuss." Complications? My coffee had gone cold, but I sipped it anyway. "What kind of complications?" "Your son Michael has filed certain protective measures with the court." She paused, probably reading from some legal document. "Given the circumstances of your wife's passing and your current state, these measures are designed to ensure your well-being." I nearly dropped the phone. My current state. I'm grieving, not senile. The filing cites concerns about decision-making capacity, she continued, each word measured like medicine. "There are provisions for temporary controls and pending observation periods, standard procedure in cases where vulnerability might be a factor." Vulnerability. The word hit me like a slap. I'd raised that boy, taught him to throw a baseball, helped him with his algebra. Now he was painting me as some doddering old fool who couldn't manage his own affairs. "How long has this been in motion?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The initial paperwork was filed 3 weeks before Mrs. Whitaker's passing, while Evelyn was still in the hospital, while I was sitting by her bed, holding her hand, believing our son was handling the estate details out of kindness. The betrayal burned worse than any physical pain I'd known. I spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, laying everything out like puzzle pieces. The pill bottles Evelyn used to organize every Sunday. The stack of bills I'd always handled without question. Each item a small testament to our competence, our independence. Every memory now tainted by doubt. My first instinct was to call Michael, demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was those years of watching Evelyn handle conflicts with quiet calculation rather than heat. "Never throw the first punch," she used to say, "when you can dodge and counter instead." The sun was setting when I finally got up to clean Evelyn's desk. Old habits die hard. She'd have hated seeing it gather dust. The wood took the lemon oil like always, warming under my hands. When I lifted the blotter to polish underneath, something small and brass caught the light. The mail key. Evelyn must have tucked it there before. The walk to our mailbox felt longer than usual in the dusk. Blue shadows stretched across the lawn as I turned the key. Inside, behind the regular mail, sat an envelope I'd missed earlier. My hands started shaking when I saw the handwriting, Evelyn's neat cursive, clear as day. The postmark was from before, her surgery. Back inside, I held the envelope under the kitchen light. A trace of her perfume still clung to the paper, that light floral scent she'd worn every day of our marriage. For a long moment, I just stood there, caught between need and fear. Some messages change everything once they're read. The paring knife sliced clean through the flap. Inside was a single card, ivory-colored, the kind Evelyn kept in her desk for important notes. 5 words in her perfect handwriting stared up at me. "Trust the tape. E. Trust the tape." I must have whispered those words 100 times that night, pacing the halls like some kind of restless ghost. Each time they felt less like words and more like a map without markers. You know how it is when you repeat something until it loses all meaning? That's where I was, somewhere between desperate and determined. Listen, I've been around long enough to know when someone's trying to tell me something important. Evelyn never did anything without purpose, especially when it came to keeping things safe. Had this methodical way about her that used to drive me crazy sometimes, but right then, I was counting on it. Started in the attic first thing next morning. That old cedar chest had been our family vault since '82. Birth certificates, marriage license, even Michael's kindergarten drawings. My knees weren't what they used to be, but I climbed those stairs anyway. Flashlight beam bouncing off dust motes, nothing but familiar papers and mothballs. The basement workbench came next. Evelyn had her own corner down there, neat as a pin with pegboard hooks labelled in her handwriting, everything in its place just like always. But no tape. Gotta be here somewhere, I muttered, heading for her sewing cabinet in the spare room. That tomato pincushion still sat proud on top, stuffed with pins she'd arranged by colour. Even opened up the pincushion itself. Evelyn was clever enough to hide something there. Still nothing. The whole time I was searching, Michael was busy too. First, my credit card got declined at the grocery store. Embarrassing as hell, let me tell you. Then the power company called about a bounced payment. Never had a check bounce in my life until that day. The final straw was this email that popped up around lunch. Dad's retirement budget, it said, like I was some teenager getting an allowance. Full of patronizing suggestions about age-appropriate activities and simplified financial management. Made my blood boil. That's when I knew I needed backup. Someone with both legal know-how and a memory long enough to remember who I really was. Richard Anderson fit the bill perfectly. Retired notary, known me, since we sang in the church choir together back in '75. Man has this way of looking at things that makes you feel like everything's going to work out, even when it's all falling apart. I called him around 2 o'clock. Richard? Walter here. Got time for coffee and a complicated conversation. He showed up an hour later with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm and that patient look he'd perfected over 40 years of watching people sign their names. Didn't rush me as I laid out the whole mess. Michael's betrayal, Evelyn's note, this mysterious tape we couldn't find. Documents leave trails, he said finally, opening his portfolio. And your Evelyn, God rest her soul, was nothing if not thorough. Let's do this right. He pulled out a camera and some legal notepads. We photograph everything, note every detail. Chain of custody. That's what matters if this goes where I think it might. Made sense to me. We waited until sunset, not wanting to attract attention from nosy neighbors. Started in the living room, working our way through every drawer and cabinet. Richard photographed each item before we moved it, made notes about where we found things. Had separate boxes for things we'd searched and things we hadn't. When we got to Evelyn's writing desk, something clicked in my mind. Hold up, I said, running my finger along one of her recipe card dividers. See how she always labeled things twice, once on top, once underneath? Richard adjusted his glasses. Insurance against wear and tear? That's what she always said. But maybe we stood there in the growing dark, staring at that polished oak desk that had been the heart of Evelyn's daily routine for decades. Tomorrow's morning light would show us what evening shadows kept hidden. Had to believe that. I laid my hand on the smooth wooden lid, feeling the warmth it still held from the day's sun. Richard cleared his throat. First light tomorrow, then? I nodded. Sometimes the hardest part of any search is knowing when to stop for the day. Yeah. Some things need daylight to be seen properly. First light crept through the curtains, painting stripes across Evelyn's writing desk. Richard was already there, punctual as always, with his leather case and a jeweler's magnifying glass. Funny how some things look different in morning light, angles you never noticed, shadows that weren't there before. You know, I said, fitting the key into the lock. She polished this desk every Sunday after church. Never missed a week in 43 years. The scent of lemon oil still clung to the wood, faint but faithful. Richard adjusted his magnifying glass, examining each joint with the focus of a surgeon. Evelyn was precise about everything. If she hid something, it'll be just as carefully done. I watched him work, his trained eye catching details I might have missed. He'd done this kind of thing before, finding hidden compartments in estate disputes, he'd told me, though I bet he never thought he'd be doing it for an old choir buddy. Walter, he said suddenly, tapping his knuckle against a thin strip near the back. The sound was different there, hollow, like knocking on an empty box. Hand me that palette knife from your workbench. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but I fetched it quick enough. Richard slid the blade carefully along what looked like a solid seam. There was a soft click, and a narrow panel lifted just enough to catch with a fingernail. Well, I'll be damned, I whispered, watching him ease the false bottom up. Evelyn, my methodical, brilliant Evelyn, she'd planned for this all along. There it was, nestled in that secret space, a cassette tape, barely bigger than my palm. The label showed her handwriting, neat as Sunday school chalk. for when he overreaches. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of whatever truth she'd recorded. 47 years of marriage, all our shared moments and quiet understandings, distilled down to this small rectangle of plastic and magnetic tape. My throat got tight. "We should take this to my office," Richard said, closing his portfolio. "Play it somewhere private, where we won't have any accidental interruptions." Before I could answer, the front door opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the hallway. Michael's walk, purposeful and sharp. I slipped the tape into my shirt pocket just as he appeared in the doorway. He filled the frame like he owned it, shoulders squared, jaw set. Didn't even acknowledge Richard. Just dropped a thick envelope on the desk blotter, making dust motes dance in the morning light. "These are eviction papers," he said flatly. "You have 1 week to vacate the premises." The room temperature seemed to spike. "Eviction?" My voice sounded far away, even to myself. "From my own home." The property assessor cited unsafe living conditions. He spoke like he was reading a grocery list. "Given your, declining situation, it's for your own good. 7 days, Dad. I've already found you a nice assisted living facility." Humiliation burned in my chest like acid reflux. 7 days. 7 days to prove I wasn't losing my mind. 7 days to save the home Evelyn and I had built together. 7 days to restore some shred of dignity. Richard cleared his throat. "As Mr. Whitaker's witness, I'll need copies of all documentation." His voice had that special notary tone, neutral but firm. Michael's lip curled slightly. "Everything's legal. Dad's lawyer has the files." He turned to leave, then paused. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." After he left, Richard gripped my shoulder. "We need to move fast, Walter, but carefully. Let's get that tape somewhere safe first, then we'll plan our next steps." I locked Evelyn's desk, running my hand over the polished surface one last time. The tape felt warm against my chest as we walked to Richard's car. At the door, I turned back to look at the house. Our house. The morning sun caught the window glass, bright enough to make me squint. The sun was barely awake when we pulled into the strip mall where Richard kept his notary office. You know those old professional buildings, all brick and narrow windows, probably built back when Kennedy was president. The kind of place that's seen thousands of documents signed, sealed, and filed away. Richard's keyring jingled in the quiet morning air. "Let me get the lights and equipment set up properly," he said, holding the door for me. "We need to do this by the book." The office wasn't much bigger than my garden shed, but it had that official feel. Filing cabinets along the walls, certificates in wooden frames, and Venetian blinds that sliced the sunrise into neat horizontal bars. The whole place smelled like toner cartridges and old paper, with just a hint of coffee from the small machine in the corner. "Have a seat, Walter," Richard said, moving behind his desk. He pulled out a heavy-duty cassette player, the kind court reporters use, and set it carefully on the blotter. "This deck is calibrated monthly, important for legal audio work." My phone buzzed in my pocket. 3 new messages. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. First was from the bank. "Your debit card transaction has been declined." Then a neighborhood watch alert someone had posted, "Concerned about elderly resident on Oak Street showing signs of confusion." The last one was from the assisted living facility Michael had picked out, requesting my medical history. I switched the phone off and set it face down. "They're moving fast," I said, watching Richard prepare his equipment. "That's why we document everything." He pulled out a fresh evidence envelope and a form. "Time, date, condition of the tape, witness signatures, it all matters." His pen scratched across the paper, marking each detail in his precise handwriting. He held up a small digital recorder. "We'll make a backup copy too. Technology's changed since Evelyn made this tape." I watched him examine the cassette under his desk lamp, turning it carefully. The shell was clean, no cracks or signs of tampering. The label was pure Evelyn, her handwriting as neat as it had been on every Christmas card and grocery list she'd ever written. The weight of what we were about to hear settled over me like a heavy blanket. What had she known? What had she seen coming that I'd missed? I could almost smell her perfume, that light floral scent she wore to church, the one that lingered on her scarves even after. "Ready?" Richard asked, snapping me back to the present. He had his notepad ready, pen poised. I nodded, gripping the armrests of my chair. The cassette slid into the deck with a solid click that seemed louder than it should have been. Richard pressed play. The machine hummed to life, then caught for a moment. My heart stopped until the heads engaged properly, and that familiar magnetic hiss filled the room. The leader tape wound through, 5 seconds of blank static. That felt like 5 hours. I leaned forward, straining to hear the first hint of her voice. Would it be instructions? A confession? Maybe just one last goodbye. Whatever was coming, I knew it would change everything. The hiss continued, steady as a heartbeat. Then the first syllable began to form, and I grabbed Richard's spare pen. Whatever Evelyn had left for us to find, I wasn't going to miss a single word. The hiss gave way to Evelyn's voice, and my world stopped spinning. She spoke with that careful clarity she always used when something needed to be perfectly understood, like when she'd explain a recipe or give directions to a lost traveler. This recording is being made on March 15th, 2 weeks before my scheduled surgery, she began. I'm of sound mind sitting at my writing desk, and what I'm about to share needs to be preserved. My throat tightened. That desk, the one I'd just searched hours ago, had been her command center where she'd paid bills and written Christmas cards for 40 years. I could picture her there, back straight, hands folded just so. Michael has been pressuring me about the will, her voice continued. It started small, questions about our finances over Sunday dinners, suggestions about protecting Dad's future. But the real push began 3 months ago. She detailed everything. How Michael would show up late at night with urgent papers that couldn't wait until morning. How he'd corner her after she'd taken her evening medications, when she was tired and fuzzy. The deadlines he'd invent, always wrapped in worried words about my welfare. Last Tuesday he caught me alone after my doctor's appointment. Evelyn's voice steadied even more. He said if I didn't sign his version of the will, he'd have Walter declared incompetent. Dad's getting forgetful, he said. It's for his own good. My hands clenched. Richard glanced at me but kept writing, his pen scratching steadily across his legal pad. So, I made a choice, Evelyn continued. I signed what Michael wanted, but it wasn't what he thought it was. You see, I've worked with enough contracts in my volunteer work to know about conditional documents. There was a smile in her voice now, that same smile she'd get when she'd solved a particularly tricky crossword puzzle. The will I signed is only a draft version. By itself, it's invalid. It requires a notarized addendum to be legal, and that addendum tells a very different story. It names Walter as primary executor and beneficiary, with Michael receiving a modest trust under specific conditions. I leaned forward, hardly breathing. That's why Michael's takeover felt too easy. He only had half the puzzle. I've made sure the addendum is properly executed and safely stored, she said. It's where old papers go to rest, where signatures sleep in numbered rows, the kind of place a son wouldn't think to look, but a notary would know well. Richard's head snapped up. Something in those words meant something to him. I could see it in his eyes. Her voice softened. Walter, my love, I'm sorry for the deception, but I knew Michael. I knew he'd try to rush things through right after. This was the only way to protect you, to protect everything we built. The tape clicked, marking what seemed like a natural break. Richard hit pause, his face carrying the careful, neutral expression I'd seen him use during complicated will readings. Richard, I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. Where is it? Where's the addendum? He set his pen down slowly, deliberately. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled 8 times. The morning was slipping away, and with it, precious hours from Michael's 7-day eviction countdown. Richard folded his hands on his desk, looking every bit the professional he'd been for 40 years. But he didn't answer. Not yet. And in that silence, I could hear time running out, tick by precious tick. Richard, I tried. Again, you know where it is, don't you? Whatever Evelyn meant about signatures sleeping in numbered rows, that means something to you. The Venetian blinds cast prison bar shadows across his desk as he reached for a fresh legal pad, his expression still carefully guarded. 7 days. We had 7 days to find that addendum and stop Michael's plan. And right now, Richard's silence felt like watching sand pour through an hourglass. Richard's eyes narrowed in concentration, like he was scanning invisible shelves in his mind. I'd seen that look before, when he'd officiate at church meetings, mentally flipping through years of minutes and motions. Wait, he said, tapping his pen against the legal pad. About 8 months ago, Evelyn came to my office, said she needed to execute an instrument for contingency, wanted it logged under the blandest descriptor possible, something that wouldn't draw attention if anyone went fishing through the records. My pulse quickened. That sounds like her. We filed it as a standard administrative supplement, Richard continued, straightening in his chair. But the way she insisted on the climate-controlled archive, the double envelope system, I should have connected it sooner. You know how sometimes hope feels dangerous? Like if you let yourself believe too quickly, it might shatter. That's how I felt, watching Richard piece it together. The archive uses a dual-key protocol, he explained, reaching for his desk drawer. Physical key plus identity verification, extra security for sensitive documents. He pulled out a heavy brass key that looked like it belonged in a museum. And I'm pretty sure I know which vault bay we need. I glanced at my watch. 6 days until Michael's eviction deadline. The weight of it sat in my chest, like a stone. How soon can we check? I asked. Right now. Richard was already reaching for his coat. But we'll need to hurry. Archive closes at noon on Saturdays. The drive across town felt like wading through molasses. Drizzle needled the windshield, and every red light seemed determined to test my patience. I watched downtown crawl past, all wet concrete and reflecting windows. Remember those old westerns where the cavalry's racing against time? That's what it felt like. Except our horses were a sensible Buick and our deadline wasn't high noon. It was regular noon. Funny how life works sometimes. Richard called ahead on his hands-free. Morning, Sarah. Yes, Richard Morton. We'll need access to Vault Bay 712. No copies needed, just verification and retrieval. Yes, we'll be there in 10. The archive building looked more like a bank than a paper warehouse, all limestone and small windows. Inside, the air had that distinct climate-controlled feel, like walking into a museum. A security desk waited past the metal detector, where I had to sign a visitor log and show my driver's license. This way, Richard said, leading me down concrete corridors that hummed with hidden ventilation systems. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, and I couldn't help thinking about all the secrets stored behind those numbered doors. How many other families had their lives filed away down here? At Vault Bay 712, Richard used his key while Sarah, the clerk, verified his credentials. The storage unit itself was about the size of a filing cabinet drawer. Richard pulled out a banker's box, stamped with an alphanumeric code that meant nothing to me. Inside that box was a tamper-evident bag, sealed with numbered security strips. Richard documented the unbroken seals in his notebook before carefully opening it, and there it was, an envelope with Evelyn's distinctive flourished E in the corner. My knees nearly buckled. All those years of watching her sign Christmas cards, I'd know that flourish anywhere. The relief hit me so hard I had to lean against the wall. You ever been so grateful you feel lightheaded? That's where I was, staring at that envelope, knowing Evelyn had outmaneuvered our son's greed from beyond the grave. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor, hard-soled shoes on concrete moving fast. I tensed, wondering if word had somehow already reached Michael. In a place like this, information was currency, and money had a way of making people talk. Richard must have read my expression, because he quickly slipped the envelope into his briefcase. Let's get this somewhere safer, he whispered. The footsteps grew closer, echoing off, the walls like a metronome counting down our remaining time. Back in Richard's office, the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across his desk. I couldn't stop staring at that envelope, the one thing standing between me and homelessness. Funny how your whole world can shrink down to a single piece of paper. Let's do this properly, Richard said, pulling on a pair of cotton archival gloves. You ever notice how some people's professional habits become part of their DNA? Richard handled documents the way a surgeon handles instruments, precise, reverent, methodical. He carefully broke the seals, documenting each step in his logbook. The way he did it reminded me of Evelyn's Sunday ritual of polishing her writing desk. Same careful attention to detail, same quiet focus. Signatures match, he murmured, comparing the addendum to known samples. Notarization dates align with the tape's timeline. He made a satisfied sound, like a mechanic who's just found the source of a troublesome knock. Walter, this is exactly what we needed. The draft Michael's using. It's invalid without this addendum. Your wife built herself a fail-safe. I felt something loosen in my chest, like finally being able to take a full breath after weeks of shallow ones. So we can stop the eviction? Before Richard could answer, His secretary knocked. "There's someone here with a delivery," she said, looking uncomfortable. "Says it's urgent." The process server wore an apologetic expression that didn't match his brisk efficiency. "Final notice," he said, holding out a thick envelope. "Sheriff's office lockout scheduled for 7 a.m. next Wednesday." My hands shook as I read the document. 3 business days, except Monday and Tuesday were closed for the county holiday, which meant, "We've got less than 48 hours, Richard said, already reaching for his phone. "We need to file an emergency petition before the clerk's office closes." He glanced at his watch. "Which gives us exactly 57 minutes. Have you ever tried to compress weeks of legal work into less than an hour?" Richard's fingers flew over his keyboard while I sorted exhibits. The tape transcript, freshly certified. The addendum, carefully copied and notarized, supporting affidavits that explained everything. "Done," Richard announced, hitting print. The office printer hummed to life, spitting out warm pages that smelled like ozone and hope. We made it to the courthouse with 12 minutes to spare. The clerk looked like she wanted to turn us away, but Richard knew exactly which local rules allowed emergency filings. I watched her stamp our papers, assign a case number, and, miracle of miracles, set a hearing for Monday morning. "First thing after the holidays," she said, handing me a yellow carbon copy. "Judge Matthews, 8 a.m. sharp." Walking out of the courthouse, I spotted Michael's car idling at the curb. That sleek black BMW he'd bought himself as a bonus last Christmas. The windows were tinted, but I knew he was watching. Probably had someone monitoring the court filing system, waiting to see what we'd do. I kept my eyes straight ahead and walked past like his car was just another piece of street furniture. You don't give people like that the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Evelyn taught me that, though she'd probably be heartbroken to know I was using that lesson against our own son. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table with Richard, building witness lists by lamplight. My neighbor who'd seen Michael pressuring Evelyn last Easter. The pharmacy tech who'd questioned why Michael kept showing up right after Evelyn's pain medication refills. The bank manager who'd noticed unusual account activity. "Try to rest," Richard said around midnight, packing up his notes. "Tomorrow we prep testimony, Monday we fight." But sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle, remembering how Evelyn used to say that night thoughts were like birds. The darker ones would always land first, but you didn't have to let them build a nest. The alarm clock's red numbers marked time like a countdown. In 48 hours, I'd either have my home and dignity back, or I'd be standing on the sidewalk with whatever possessions I could carry. The fluorescent lights in courtroom B hummed like angry wasps as I settled into the hard wooden chair behind the petitioner's table. You know that feeling when your whole life hangs on what happens in the next hour. That's what was churning in my stomach. Richard set down 3 black binders with color-coded tabs, organized the way Evelyn would have done it. I had to smile at that, remembering how she'd labeled everything in her recipe box twice, once for what it was, once for where to find it. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and Judge Matthews swept in wearing black robes that looked freshly pressed. She had the kind of face that gave away nothing. Might as well try. Reading tea leaves in an empty cup. I couldn't help noticing the growing crowd filtering in through the back doors. Mrs. Peterson from next door, who'd brought casseroles after Evelyn passed. Tom from the hardware store, who'd seen Michael's wellness checks turn into interrogations. Even my nephew David had driven up from Cincinnati. Their whispers rustled like autumn leaves in the gallery. Michael sat across the aisle with his lawyer, Mr. Warner, one of those slick types who probably charged more per hour than I used to make in a week. They had their heads together, wearing matching smirks that said they thought this was already wrapped up. Michael wouldn't even look my direction. "Your Honor." Warner stood up smooth as silk for his opening. "This is a simple matter of protecting a vulnerable senior from undue influence. Mr. Whitaker's cognitive decline." My hands clenched under the table. Cognitive decline? I could still build a cabinet with dovetail joints tight enough to make a master craftsman weep. "Has made him susceptible to manipulation by Richard Harrison, a notary who's overstepped his bounds. These alleged documents and recordings are nothing but a desperate attempt to interfere with the deceased's clear wishes." Richard was first up after openings. He walked through every step of finding the tape, documenting its condition, making certified copies. His voice stayed steady as he referenced his notary logs, showing dates that lined up perfect with Evelyn's timeline. "And Mrs. Whitaker executed the addendum in your presence?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor. She specifically requested neutral coding to prevent premature discovery, standard practice for sensitive instruments." I felt a flutter of hope, watching the judge make notes. But then Warner sprang up like a jack-in-the-box. "Objection, Your Honor. This alleged recording is textbook hearsay. The deceased cannot be cross-examined. We move to exclude." The courtroom went quiet enough to hear the wall clock ticking. Judge Matthews tapped her pen against the bench, studying both sides. Every tick felt like an eternity. Finally, she leaned forward. "Given the testamentary context and Mr. Harrison's supporting documentation, I'll allow the recording for limited purpose. Bailiff, please set up the playback equipment." My throat went dry as the bailiff wheeled in speakers on a cart. This was it. Evelyn's voice was about to fill this room. Would everyone else hear what I heard in those words? The pain, the careful planning, the love wrapped in her warning? I gripped the edge of the table, wood smooth under my palms like all those years of workshop patience had trained me. For this moment, the bailiff pressed play, and I heard the soft hiss of the leader tape. You ever notice how time seems to slow down right before something big happens? Like those split seconds between dropping a glass and it hitting the floor? That's what these moments felt like. Stretched out, crystal clear and completely out of my control. The whole gallery leaned forward as the hiss continued. Michael's smirk started to waver. Richard sat, perfectly still, hands folded on top of his binder, and I waited, holding my breath for Evelyn's voice to tell her truth to everyone. The hiss faded, and there she was, my Evelyn, clear as Sunday morning bells. "My name is Evelyn Marie Whitaker. Today is March 15th, and I'm making this recording of sound mind without duress in Richard Harrison's presence." A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Michael's shoulders went rigid. Mrs. Peterson pressed a hand to her mouth. "I need to document what's been happening with our son Michael," Evelyn continued. "It started small, suggestions about Walter's forgetfulness, comments about how we needed help with finances. But last month, after my diagnosis..." Her voice caught for just a moment. I remembered that day, the doctor's office, antiseptic smell, her hand squeezing mine while we heard the news. Michael began visiting late at night, always when Walter was asleep. He'd bring papers saying they needed immediate signatures. When I hesitated, he'd mention nursing homes, adult protective services, said he could make things difficult if I didn't cooperate. The whispers started. David, my nephew, was shaking his head. Tom from the hardware store leaned forward, brow furrowed. April 3rd, around midnight, Michael insisted I sign what he called the final version of my will. He'd already removed Walter's access to our accounts, claimed it was temporary until the papers were done. When I asked to wait for morning to review everything with Walter present, Michael said... Her voice hardened. He said, "Dad's not competent anymore. Sign now or I'll have him declared unfit tomorrow." The judge's pen stopped moving. Warner, Michael's lawyer, was scribbling so fast, his paper crinkled. I signed what Michael wanted, a conditional draft that means nothing without the properly notarized addendum I've prepared separately. Every change he forced, every restriction he added, is nullified by that document. Michael's face had gone the color of old putty. He wouldn't look at anyone now, just stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "I've watched my husband build our life with these hands," Evelyn said, and I swear I could hear her smile. 47 years of honest work, raising a family, giving more than he kept. The house he maintained, the garden he tends, they're not just property, they're his heart made visible. Mrs. Peterson was dabbing her eyes. Even the bailiff looked touched. "I'm not recording this out of anger or revenge," Evelyn said firmly. "I'm protecting the man I love from a betrayal he doesn't deserve. The addendum restores everything to our original plan. Walter retains full rights and control. Michael receives his share only after demonstrating 3 years of ethical financial behavior, verified by an independent trustee." The gallery murmured. Michael's lawyer was tugging at his collar. "To my son, I hope you find your way back to the person we raised you to be. To my Walter, I'm sorry I kept this burden quiet. You taught me that good work speaks for itself. This is my last project, my love. Making sure your work stays spoken for." The tape clicked off. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Judge Matthews cleared her throat. "We'll recess for 1 hour while I review the notarial records, and verify the addendum meets statutory requirements. Court will resume at 11:45. The gavel cracked and everyone stood. As people filed out, I felt lighter somehow, like a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there had finally lifted. I turned and found Michael staring at me from across the aisle. Those blue eyes, Evelyn's eyes in our son's face, held mine for a long moment. I didn't see the smirk anymore. Didn't see much of anything except maybe the first flicker of shame. I held his gaze steady, the way I'd hold a level checking a fence post. Didn't nod, didn't frown. Just let the truth hang there between us, doing its work. The hour passed like molasses in January. When we filed back in, I counted the sounds. Shoes on carpet, papers rustling, the soft whoosh of the judge's robe as she took her seat. The bailiff called us to order, and silence dropped like a heavy curtain. Judge Matthews adjusted her glasses, looking down at all of us from the bench. Judge Matthews tapped her papers straight, the sound sharp as a carpenter's pencil marking wood. After reviewing the evidence, including Mrs. Whitaker's recorded testimony and the properly executed addendum, this court finds several matters clear. She looked over her glasses. The document presented as Mr. Walter Whitaker's current will is, in fact, a conditional draft lacking legal force. Mrs. Whitaker's addendum, properly notarized and preserved, stands both valid and controlling. My hands, rough from decades of working wood, stayed steady in my lap. Beside me, Richard gave a small, satisfied nod. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court finds no evidence supporting claims of diminished capacity or need for protective oversight. All attempts to restrict Mr. Whitaker's financial and property rights are hereby voided. The gallery rippled like wind through summer leaves. I heard Susan, my niece, whisper, "Oh my God," from somewhere behind me. Mr. Michael Whitaker's appointment as executor is vacated, effective immediately. All property control reverts to Mr. Walter Whitaker. The eviction notice is dissolved, and any pending actions against the property are stayed. Michael's lawyer started to rise, but the judge wasn't finished. Given the circumstances revealed by Mrs. Whitaker's recording, this court strongly suggests Mr. Michael Whitaker seek independent counsel regarding his fiduciary conduct. Judgment entered. We're adjourned. The gavel crack echoed like a splitting board. You know that moment when you're sanding and finally hit clean wood beneath the weathered surface. That's how I felt. Stripped down to truth, ready to build again. People shuffled past, but nobody met Michael's eyes. Tom from the hardware store, who'd been calling me confused old Walt last week, suddenly found his shoelaces fascinating. The Petersons, our neighbors for 20 years, hurried out like they'd spotted smoke. I gathered my papers while Richard handled the formal orders. Didn't rush. A good craftsman never rushes cleanup. When I headed for the water fountain in the corridor, Michael was there, looking deflated as a tire that hit a nail. "Dad, He cleared his throat. "I guess I got carried away. You know how estate stuff can get complicated. Maybe we can—" "Complicated?" The word tasted like sawdust. "You cancelled my cards, told the neighbors I was losing my mind, tried to throw me out of my own house. Each fact landed like a hammer strike. Your mother would have—" But I stopped there. Some broken things aren't worth fixing. Michael's face worked like he was trying on expressions, looking for one that might help. "I'll make it right. We can start over, maybe set up a family council or something." Already planning his next project. Just like always. I thought about the nights I'd lain awake, checking my pill counts because he'd said I was confused. The groceries I couldn't buy when my cards stopped working. The shame of neighbors watching me like I might wander off. "No," I said quietly. "We won't." Richard appeared with the court orders, and I signed them right there on the wall. My signature was as steady as when I used to mark lumber. No shake, no hesitation. Just the truth laid down in ink. The clerk handed over my house keys, keys that should never have left my possession. I rolled them in my palm, feeling their familiar edges. Behind me, Michael was still talking, something about misunderstandings and fresh starts. But I was already walking away, same as I'd walk from a project that couldn't be salvaged. Outside, the sky had cleared to that deep autumn blue that makes every edge sharp. I breathed in air that smelled like turning leaves and thought about Evelyn's garden bench. It needed work, just a light sanding, some fresh varnish, nothing major. But it was mine to fix now, mine to keep or change or leave exactly as she'd loved it. I slid behind the wheel of my truck, started the engine, and pointed toward home. Real home, where every door would answer to my key again. The next few weeks moved like a slow tide washing things clean. Every morning, I'd wake up early, brew coffee just the way I liked it, and tackle one more item on my restoration list. First came the bank accounts. You should have seen the manager's face when I walked in with that court order. Went from concerned about your situation to, how can we help you today, Mr. Whitaker? Faster than a power saw through pine. Took about an hour to lift all those protective freezes Michael had scattered around like loose nails. Your credit cards will be reactivated by end of business, the manager said, shuffling papers. And we've noted that any future account restrictions require direct judicial approval. Richard helped me document everything. That man's attention to detail would put a master carpenter to shame. We photographed each restored document, filed copies with the court, and kept a running log of every correction notice sent out to undo Michael's handiwork. Better to build a clear record, Richard said one afternoon, organizing another binder. Shows you're more than capable of managing your affairs. He was right, of course. The same neighbors who'd been whispering about my confusion got front-row seats to my competence. Bills paid early, yard kept trim, house maintenance steady as a level bubble. Every visible sign that Michael's claims were as hollow as a rotted beam. The medical clearances were next. My doctor, who'd known me for 15 years, wrote a letter so strongly worded it could have stripped paint. Mr. Whitaker displays cognitive function well above age-appropriate norms, she'd written. Any suggestion of diminished capacity is, frankly, absurd. That letter went to every office where Michael had planted his little seeds of doubt. The retirement community he'd tried to reserve for me, the elder care service he'd contacted, the financial advisor he'd appointed without my knowledge. One by one, those arrangements crumbled like sawdust. I heard through Susan that Michael wasn't showing his face much at family gatherings anymore. The recording had done its work there. Everybody who'd sat in that courtroom knew exactly what he'd tried to pull. Thanksgiving invitations dried up. Christmas card lists got shorter. Even his old poker group, I'm told, suddenly had no open seats at the table. He made his own bed, Richard said when I mentioned it. Now he's lying in it. But I didn't waste time tracking Michael's fall. Didn't need to. Instead, I focused on bringing things back to true, like squaring up an old frame that's worked itself crooked. My finest work, though, that was Evelyn's garden bench. I'd built it for our 30th anniversary. White oak, mortise, and tenon joints, every angle calculated to match the curve of her back. She'd sit there for hours, reading or just watching. Bees work the lemon blossoms. I took my time with the restoration, stripped off years of weather, working through grits until the wood felt like silk under my palms, tightened every bolt, replaced the ones that showed wear. 3 coats of marine sealant, because Evelyn always said things worth doing were worth doing right. Late afternoon sun was painting everything gold when I carried that bench back to its spot under the lemon tree. The curtains she'd sewn years ago still hung in the kitchen window, dancing whenever the breeze picked up. I could almost smell her lemon squares cooling on the windowsill. Setting that bench down felt like closing a circle. I ran my hand along the arm, smooth as the day I'd first built it, and thought about how Evelyn had known. Known what Michael might try, known what we'd need to fight it, known exactly how to protect everything we'd built together. You always could see clearer than the rest of us, I said softly to the evening air. The wind rustled leaves overhead like a gentle answer. I settled onto the bench, feeling how it still fit perfectly after all these years. Above me, stars were starting to punch through twilight, bright as nail-heads in old wood. In that quiet moment, watching darkness soften the garden edges, I finally understood the full weight of what Evelyn had taught me. Greed buries itself deeper than any grave.